what we're going to look at this morning is this idea of storms, right? And it's a pretty simple sermon. It's a pretty simple passage. Storms are going to come into our lives, right? I've heard many pastors say, right, either for each of you, you're either coming out of a storm, you're in a storm, or you're headed into a storm, right? So that's the good news this morning, right? Anybody in here been through a storm in their life? Right? If not, everybody find the people that aren't raising their hands and go ask them how they've managed to get through life without going through any storms. Right? We all go through storms. And so just three simple things that I want to share with you this morning. The first is that as you follow Jesus, storms will come. And we shouldn't be surprised by this. In fact, Jesus spoke about it often. In John 16:33, he said, I have said these things to you that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So in the world we're going to have tribulation, but we shouldn't lose heart about that, right? A little bit later in John 17, he says this. He says in verse 13, but now I am coming to you, Father, and these things I speak in the world, that they may have my joy fulfilled in themselves. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. He says, hey, these are my people. I'm saying these things so that their joy can increase. And they are not of the world, just as I was not of the world. But I'm not asking you, Father, to remove them from the world. I'm not asking you to take them out of all the storms. I'm not asking you to take them far away from all of it. What I'm asking is that you would keep them from the evil one, that you would preserve them in the world, even though they're not of the world. And in 1 Peter, we did a whole series on this a little while back. It says, in 1 Peter 4:12, he says, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. Man, as we've been walking through the book of Acts and we've been looking at the life of Paul, we have seen him face and experience trial after difficulty. He was persecuted, he was arrested, he was chained, he was imprisoned, he was stoned to the point of death. They walked away because they thought he was dead, right? And he came back, and continually he goes forward. And so Paul experienced storms, Jesus experienced storms, and we're going to experience storms. And to the extent at which we're completely surprised and shocked and just in dismay when storms come along, it hampers our ability to be able to navigate through them and to go through them. And so the question for us this morning is, are you shocked? Are you shocked when trials come your way? And I'm not saying that you should go through life with this kind of plastic grin on your face and never feel anything and never experience anything. I'm not saying that you shouldn't grieve when you experience loss. I'm not saying that you shouldn't mourn. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be emotional. But what I'm saying is that you should also pair that with an understanding of like, okay, Jesus told me I would go through this. Jesus told me that it would be hard. He told me that I would have tribulations and struggles, that the world would be opposed to me. And so while I don't want this, while I don't enjoy this, while I don't desire this, I'm also not shocked and just taken aback by it. Sometimes the amount that a trial impacts your life is in direct proportion to the weight that we give to it. Let me say that one more time. Sometimes the amount that a trial impacts our life is in direct proportion to the weight that we give to it. In the Bible, we use this word glory, and another way of saying glory is weight. And so in essence, it's what you're giving glory to. What has the most weight in your life? You think about the classic example of the teenage heartbreak, right? Like the teenager crying themselves to sleep on their pillow because the person of their dreams broke up with them, right? And it's real to you in the moment, and it's so intense. But your parents and those that love you are like, hey, I promise you it's going to be okay. I went through the same thing, right? I think about some of the teenage heartbreaks that I had, and now with years of experience behind, I can look back and say, Lord, thank you so much. Thank you that you did not answer my tearful prayer. Thank you that you did not give me what I was asking for in that moment. Even though I thought my life was over and the world was ending, I gave a ton of weight to that trial, that storm in my life. It was immense in that moment. But when we can look at things with perspective, it changes the impact of the storm. And usually what these are idol identification moments, I would call them, right? You have an idol in your heart. You're not willing to admit it. You're not willing to acknowledge it, but there's something that you're valuing, that it's your reason for being. It's your purpose in life. It's the thing without which your life would not have any reason to go forward. And when it's exposed in the midst of a storm and shown to be faulty, it's really painful. But it can also be really helpful, right? It can be a blessing from God when those things are opened and exposed so that we can see them for what they are and we can move away from them. There was a classic story of this in the Old Testament, the story of Naaman. Are you guys familiar with the story of Naaman? Naaman was a military leader of an enemy army of the people of Israel, and he had actually gone on raiding parties in and kidnapped and stolen people out of Israel. And so there was a servant girl that he had in his household that he had kidnapped from her family and brought her into his home to serve him as a slave. And Naaman suffered from leprosy. And so it was an incurable disease. He was dying little by little. And the servant girl looked and said, man, there's a prophet in Israel that could heal him. And so she had the graciousness to offer him this hope. And so he gathers a bunch of money and resources, and he goes to the king of Israel, and he says, heal me. I'm ready to pay for my healing. And the king's like, I can't heal you. I don't have that power. But the prophet Elisha says, send him to me. And so he's sent to Elisha. Elisha doesn't even come out of the house. He just says, hey, servant, go tell Naaman that he just needs to go wash himself 7 times in the Jordan River. And when this happens, Naaman is so offended that he would be asked to do this menial task. He came in royal garb. He came with an entourage. He came with riches. And now the prophet won't even come and talk to him face to face. And he tells him to just go down and wash himself in the muddy river. And he's so offended that he starts to leave and go away. But one of his servants comes to him and says, Master, you've been through so much. All he's asking you to do is wash it. I mean, isn't it worth just going down and washing in the river? We all need those people in our life, right, that can speak into our storms when we give so much weight. I mean, all the things that he had been through, and basically the one that he let completely derail him was that a prophet was unwilling to come and meet him face to face, and he told him to do this simple task. And that was the storm that just put him over the edge, where he said, I'm done, I'm out of here, I'm leaving, right? But someone with wisdom came along and said, hey, maybe you should do it. Spoiler alert, he does it. He gets healed. What are you giving weight to? Are you in the midst of a storm right now? And are you giving the glory and the weight and the heaviness to something that maybe with a different perspective doesn't deserve the emphasis that you're putting on it? Doesn't mean it's not significant. Doesn't mean it's not important. But maybe it's not as important as you're making it out to be. And maybe what you need as much as a change of circumstances is a change of perspective. I used to pray a lot for God to change my circumstances. And what I've shifted towards doing more is now I pray a lot more for God to change my perspective. God, teach me how to be happy if nothing changes. Teach me how to just, if nothing changes, if nothing gets better, if this doesn't improve, if the relationship doesn't change, if whatever it is, even if it doesn't get better, teach me how to still love you and honor you and have joy and experience thankfulness in the midst of this. And I've learned that that's a better prayer because even if the circumstances change, even if you get exactly what you prayed for, the odds are that in a little while you're not going to be happy with that either, right? Right? I never prayed for my iPhone, and I don't even know where it is right now, but 2 years ago it was the coolest thing ever. Actually, about 3.5 years ago now, right? But now it's essentially a paperweight, right? Like I'm like, oh, when I get my new one, I'll just chuck this one off a bridge or something, right? Like they don't last. I'm not going to chuck it off the bridge, don't worry. I'm not, for those environmentally conscious among us, right? As you follow Jesus, storms are going to come. The second thing is you don't have to enter every storm. Storms are certainly going to come, but you don't have to enter into every storm. Let's look at verse 9. Let's look what he says. I think I have it up on the screen here for you. Acts 27, verse 9 says, "Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because of the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, 'Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives.' But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul had said." The centurion was also ultimately the one who was making the call on this. And Paul advised him wisely. He said, hey, it's too late in the season. It was after the feast, the fall feast, and so it would have been around this time of year, September, October. Sea voyage had become really dangerous, and he was advising them, like, guys, this is not a good idea. We shouldn't do this. But he listened to those that were seeking profit and gain rather than the one who was seeking their protection. And so as we think about the storm, sometimes we willingly enter into storms of our own volition because we think we're going to get something out the other side, right? And so we have to question our motivations. Who are you paying attention to? What are their motivations? The reality is this, that life is full of risk, right? Nearly every decision that we make in life involves some sort of risk management. And the question is really, are the risks that I'm taking worth the result that I expect to get? And there's been a lot of times where those sort of risks lead you to incredible storms and peril. Did you guys ever watch that show Gold Rush that's on Discovery Channel or whatever it is? Anybody know? These guys basically risk their whole life. They stake they dump all their money. They go up to Alaska to pan for gold. And every season, it's like incredibly difficult / virtually impossible / they lose everything, right? And I got sucked in like 4 seasons. I'm like, one of these times they're just going to strike it rich and find a vein of gold, and it's going to, and over again. But they keep willingly because the temptation of like, man, I might be able to do it. We do the same things in our own lives, right? And so we think about risk and reward. Are the potential risks that I'm taking worth the reward? And there's a lot of times in those moments where the storm that comes along is actually, in secret, it's a gift from God. Because once again, it's like our hearts are chasing after this idolatrous thing. And so God has to allow the storm to come to remove the idol from our hearts. These sailors, they wanted to make a lot of money, right? They had this cargo, this grain that they were taking to the Roman Empire. They were expecting a big payday. Well, a few days into the storm, they started dumping everything overboard, right? The thing that had led them into the storm, now they couldn't get rid of soon enough because it was the thing that was dragging them down. There's another story of a voyage, a sea voyage that ends in a storm in the Bible. It's with a prophet named Jonah. Jonah chose to disobey God. God said, I want you to go to Nineveh, to the enemy nation. I want you to proclaim my word to them. And Jonah said, nope, I'm going to go the exact opposite way. And he got in a boat and he started going the exact opposite direction of where God wanted him to go. And we're told in the Bible that God sent the storm to oppose Jonah in that moment. So the question this morning is, are you making choices that are sending you into a storm? Are you taking on risk for the wrong reasons? Or are you taking on risk for godly reasons? And there's risks that are worth taking, right? Everything in life involves risk. But the question is, are you weighing the risk, the value of the risk? Think about your life, the things that you're doing that are chances. What do you expect out of it? Or are you just being driven along like the sailors in this passage? Do you feel like you're just in the boat and the winds are just blowing and you've completely lost control at this point? Where are you at with that? Now, the third thing, and I think this is the most significant, storms are going to come, but you can choose to not enter every storm through wise choices. But the third thing is that who you are in the midst of the storm reveals your true identity. Who the storm reveals you to be is who you are. Right? These moments of trial, these moments in the midst of the storm, that's when your character emerges for yourself and for everyone around you to see. Right? We heard the horrific reports about what happened in Pittsburgh this weekend. And alongside of that, there are these reports of the police and the first responders who were running into the building, right? In that moment, they weren't hiding outside. They weren't waiting. They went in. It's a moment of heroism, right? In the midst of the storm, your identity is revealed. Look at Acts chapter 27, verse 21. It says, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up and among them, and he said, men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. And yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on some island. Man, so much of Paul's character is revealed in this moment, right? Keep in mind, he's a prisoner. He's in chains, he's a prisoner, and he's being taken for a trial that could lead to his death. And yet, in the midst of it, he has everyone else's intention. He has everyone else's well-being in mind. He's choosing to be a leader. The one who's in chains as a prisoner is standing up to take the lead in the midst of this storm. Even though they didn't listen to his warning, and how many times do we stop there, right? You should have listened when I told you. And then that's where we're done, right? And then we walk off, or then we stomp off, or then we go off on our own and bask in our self-righteousness. I knew it. I was right. But Paul doesn't do that. He states it truly. You should have listened to me. I tried to warn you this was going to happen, and you didn't listen to me. But guess what? I serve a God who's merciful and gracious. And it's apparent that he was praying for their well-being and their safety, because the angel says to him, he says, behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. And so that seems to indicate that Paul, not only was he praying that God would bring them through the storm, but he was praying for the lives of those that were on board with him. These pagan sailors, these men and possibly women who didn't know God, but he was praying for their lives. He cared about all 276 people that were on board of this ship. I also appreciate that Paul's character is revealed in that he didn't try and write the script for God. He was grateful for the path that God had provided. I mean, can you imagine when the angel appeared and he's like, hey, Paul, good news. You're going to make it through this storm. But the ship, not going to make it, right? And, I can imagine if I was Paul, I would probably be like, hey, you know what? That's awesome. And thank you for that. But I know that Jesus actually was just able to stop a storm like that. So that's an option you could pursue. Or, it'd be nice to make it to dry land on the ship. Like, maybe do we do this, right? We come to God not only with our requests, but with suggestions for him of how he might accomplish our requests, right? Like, hey, God, I've got some great ideas I'd like to bounce off you about how you could fix this situation in my life. But Paul resists the temptation to, and then we pout when he doesn't do it our way, right? Sometimes God answers our prayers, but he doesn't do it our way, and we pout about it. But Paul doesn't do that. Paul says, hey, good news. God has spoken. He's going to bring us through it. The ship is going to get wrecked, but we're all going to make it to dry land, and we should be grateful for that. He had a gratefulness for what he had, right? He wasn't focused on what he wasn't going to have. He was focused on what he had. And there's so many times that we focus on what we don't have rather than what we have. Now, I want to compare this to Jonah. And I think it's worth the time just to briefly read the account that we get in the Bible of Jonah in a very similar situation and how his character, and listen for how Jonah's character is revealed in this account, right? It says, now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of God. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare. He went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. And the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had laid down and was fast asleep. And so the captain came and said to him, what do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish. And they said to one another, come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. And so they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? Where is your country? And of what people are you?" He said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of God because he had told them. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know that it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to try to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." And so they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Look at Jonah's character revealed in the storm compared to Paul's, right? Jonah was, first of all, he went down, right, hiding below deck in the ship. He didn't want to interact with any of these pagans in his mind, right? And it's interesting. Paul's mission was to go and take the good news of the gospel not only to the Israelites, but to the Gentiles as well. His heart was for people that were not originally a part of God's tribe. Jonah was the exact opposite. He only wanted God to be the God of the Hebrews. And he didn't want to go and take that message to anybody else, right? And so there was this discrimination in his heart right off the bat, right? We see that Jonah wasn't praying. He was downstairs sleeping. Paul is praying for his life, praying for the lives of those that are with him, praying for others that are around him. Jonah's not praying even for himself. He's just sleeping selfishly, right? He's not concerned for his fellow passengers. And when they finally call him out, instead of repenting before God and saying, "God, what have I done? Forgive me. Forgive these men. Save us. Bring us to safety," he says, "Just throw me in the ocean," right? Just chuck me overboard. He chose judgment over repentance. He essentially said, "I'd rather die, be cast into the sea, than repent and ask God forgiveness and ask God to relent." The last trial that you went through, which character was closer to your character? Which one looked a little bit more like you? What trials can do is they can focus incredibly inward, where we're self-focused, where we only see ourselves, we only think about ourselves, we don't look out around us. Part of the reason that Paul had perspective was that he was praying to the Lord to see what bigger thing God was doing. Christians are meant to be a blessing to those around them. Paul encourages, he comforts, he leads, he corrects, and ultimately he's the reason for their survival. If you're a follower of Jesus, how are you being used as a blessing to those around you? How are you using your favor and blessing for the benefit of others? What are the storms in your life revealing about your identity? Where you put your trust? Are you concerned only for yourself, or are you concerned for others? You know, one of the trials, one of the storms, and it may seem minimal, right? But one of the things that I'm experiencing, and that our church in some levels is experiencing, is the storm, the trial of sending out a church plant, right? We sent out people that we love, that we had built deep relationships with, that were incredible servants in the community. They were a part of our community, and so we've sent them out. And the temptation is to mourn the loss of those relationships, right? And it's not like we're cut off from them, right? But they're not here on Sunday morning with us. They're not here. They were some of our best teachers in our kids' classes. They were small group leaders. They served as worship leaders here in the church. And so I've been wrestling in my heart. Sometimes I look more at what God has taken to multiply than I look what He has brought. And I can lose perspective on that. Maybe it's the same way for you. Maybe there's times when you're thinking about the relationships that you've lost and the relationships that you don't have, and the things that God has taken away rather than the things that God has provided. So part of the secret, Jesus said, "Hey, I'm saying these words because I want them to have joy." And so as the gospel works its way into your heart, it should lead you to take joy in what God is doing for you now. There's another stormy journey that's recorded in Scripture. Jesus was in a boat that sailed into a storm. In fact, that storm wasn't even the biggest of his life trials, right? He faced trials and storms throughout his life, ultimately leading to the ultimate storm, which was his crucifixion on the cross. Personal sin and idolatry were never the cause of his storms, right? He never entered a storm because of a failure on his part. It was never sin. It was never wrong motivation. It was never idolatry. Each storm that he entered into was one in which he weighed the risk. He knew the cause, and he knew that it was worth it. The conflicts with the Pharisees, and ultimately the 100% chance of death that he had in coming here to sacrifice himself for you and I. And he decided to do it because it was worth it. Who Jesus was in the midst of the storm demonstrated his identity, right? When he was in the storm with the disciples, they came and they woke him up and said, "Master, don't you care?" They didn't know that Jesus cared for them. But he stood up and like that, the winds, the waves, everything ceased. He had the power to end it in a moment. He had ultimate power over all things. And so when the storm of crucifixion came, he had the power to make it stop. Yet he chose to allow the storm. He willingly gave his life when he had the complete power at any moment to choose to do otherwise. That is his character. That's the character of the one who promises to never leave you nor forsake you, the one who promises to be with you to the very end of the age. If he is for us, who can be against us? Yes, you will enter storms, but you will not enter them alone. Jesus is with you in the storm. He loves you. And if you will, the storm can actually drive you closer to him. Let the storms of your life be an opportunity to rest completely in him and nothing else. I am is with you in the storm. Join me in prayer. God, I thank you that you're with us in the storm. I've spent so much time praying for the storms to cease, the storms to go away, and Lord, I recognize that we just need you to be with us in the storms. Give us wisdom. Give us wisdom to avoid if there's things that we're entering into that we don't need, that are going to bring pain and harm to us, that are just a lack of wisdom and discernment. God, show us that today. Show us the things we need to turn away from, the voyages we need to avoid, the idols that are pulling us in that direction, God. But we know that inevitably, and even sometimes for your will and your glory, we will enter into storms. I pray for each person in this room that they would just feel your presence so closely in whatever storm they're in right now. They would know that you're in it, that you love them, that you're all-powerful, that you're full of grace, that you're full of wisdom. Help each of us to lean into you today, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.